For this example, we're going to identify the extrema. That's kind of a fancy word. It basically means extreme values. And for us, for our graph, when we take a look at these graphs, our extreme values essentially mean the maximum and the minimum values. So extrema is a singular word that describes all of those things, maximums and minimums. And when we talk about maximums and minimums on a graph, what we're talking about are wherever we have essentially a peak or a valley in the graph. So if you were to take a look at this graph that I have in front of me, and we take a look at this graph, if we go and start just kind of on the left side and look at the graph as we go from left to right, we're going upward here for a little while, and then we reach a peak here. There's a point up there at the top. As we continue along the graph, eventually we get to a valley. And there's a point there. We get to another peak, and then the graph goes down for forever. So this graph will have three extrema. It has three peaks and valleys, or it has a total of three maximums and minimums. Anytime you're at a peak, that is a maximum. So this graph has two maximums, and we have one minimum. When we describe maximums and minimums, our book is going to use two adjectives to describe them: relative and absolute. If you take a look at this graph, we do have two maximums because we have two peaks. Both of these are relative maximums. What that means is if you were to just zoom in and look at like just this part of the graph, this point here is the highest one. It is at a maximum. That doesn't guarantee that it is the highest point on the entire graph, but relative to the points around it, it is the highest. So this is a relative maximum. We have another relative maximum here, and we have a relative minimum here. We want to identify the extrema, so we want to identify those maximums and minimums. All of our maximums and minimums are relative maximums or relative minimums, but if you have a relative maximum or minimum, and it happens to be the highest or lowest point, then we are more specific, and instead of calling that a relative maximum or a relative minimum, we call it an absolute maximum or minimum. So here's the process. You take a quick look at your graph. You look at where the peaks and valleys are. Every peak and every valley is going to be a relative maximum or a relative minimum. In this case, we have two relative maximums, but we should check and see if either of them are absolute because that's a more specific name, and we want to give these the most specific name possible. So when I look at this relative maximum here, what I need to ask myself is, yes, this is the highest point relative to the points that are all around it. But as far as the entire graph goes, is this the highest point or not? And no, it's not. There are other points over here that are higher than this one. So this is just a relative maximum. This relative maximum, is this the highest point on the graph? And the answer to that question is yes. So this point right here is an absolute maximum because it is the very highest point. And this one we would just call a relative maximum. There's only one minimum on this problem. There's only one valley. It is a relative minimum. To see if it is an absolute minimum, we want to see if this is the lowest point on the graph. But there are lots of points that are lower than this point. So this point is just a relative minimum. So to identify the extrema, there's no work for you to go through and show. You just need to list out any absolute or relative maximums or minimums, and we would do that by listing out an approximation for their ordered pair. So for instance, this one right here we said was a relative maximum. And we want to list that out as an ordered pair. So if I approximate that, it looks like it's at about negative 1.52 or maybe 2.1. So a negative 1.52 or 2.1 would be good. So there's our ordered pair for this relative maximum. We also have a relative minimum here. This relative minimum, if I were to approximate that, looks like it's at about negative 0.3 for the x-coordinate and also about negative 0.3 for the y-coordinate. This point right here we said is a relative maximum, but more specifically it's an absolute maximum because it is the highest point. If this were just a relative maximum, we would just list another ordered pair out there, but this is an absolute, and that's a better name. It's a more specific name. So we have an absolute maximum in this problem at this point right here. We just need to take a look and, again, approximate that ordered pair. So that looks like about maybe 1.1 comma 3, roughly. 1.1 comma 3 would be a good approximation for that absolute maximum. Let's take a quick look at another graph. So again, as I take a quick look at this graph, I see that we have some peaks and valleys. As I travel along the graph from left to right, we get to a valley here and a peak here, another valley here, and a peak here. When I look at the two peaks, I'd want to see if any of these relative maximums are absolute, but if I look at either one of these peaks, there are other points that are higher, so neither of these are absolute maximums, they are both relative maximums. And the same thing with our minimum values. We happen to have two valleys, we have two minimums, but neither of these are the lowest point because our graph goes down over here on the right side. So we have two relative maximums and two relative minimums in this problem. Our relative maximum values, I want to identify those ordered pairs. This one looks like it is at the origin, so probably 0, 0. And this one, if I approximate, looks like maybe 1.8 or 1.9, and then maybe about 4.2 or so. So I'll say 1.8 and about 4.2. That would be a decent ordered pair to approximate that. Both of these are relative minimums. This one looks like it is about negative 0.9, negative 2. And then this ordered pair here looks like it's maybe at about 0.7 and negative 0.4. So when you identify the extrema, you want to identify the peaks and the valleys. Those are the maximums and minimums. And then you want to look at those maximum and minimum values and determine if they are relative or if they are absolute maximums or minimums, and list those points out as ordered pairs.